there, I'm Andre.
And I'm Battle.
And we're the hosts of Bros and Murder, a true crime podcast where we cover true crime cases of color.
And we cover dumb cases that happen. And listen to good music.
Yeah, we also listen to music too. No, it's okay. So just subscribe wherever you get podcasts. Come hang out with us and, just be gravy.
I think if you have a true crime of color that you think that we should cover, drop us a line.
Let us know. Drop us a line.
Hello listeners, and welcome to this week's episode of the Cult Vault. For this episode, we are going to be revisiting a movement I have spoken about before. In the earlier days of this podcast, I spoke about the Unification Church, otherwise known as the Moonies, and today I will speak with Jane. Jane offers a candid insight into the history of the church and the strange rituals that make up this religion. Listen closely as Jane tells us about her own arranged marriage and getting close to the Moon family. Before we get started, I just wanted to quickly mention my Patreon. You can support the podcast from as little as £1 a month, but you can also do other things to help the podcast. You could leave me a review, or if you have an Android device, you can download our brand new app, the Cult Vault Podcast, on Google Play. But for now, here is Jane. So hello, Jane. Thank you for agreeing to come and chat with me on my podcast today. I'm excited to get to hear your story because it's actually something that I have covered. And usually during these interviews, I'm learning things for the first time. But I know you're going to give me a perspective that I haven't heard before. So would you like to introduce yourself to our listeners and tell them a little bit about who you are?
Sure. Hi, listeners. I'm Jane. I am a second generation Unification Church member. I left about 8 years ago. So I grew up in the church. No longer a part of it. My interests now are varied. Salsa dancing, drawing, yoga. I'm a yoga teacher. I got a degree in international relations and diplomacy, a master's degree, and currently living in Texas.
Wow, so you have your creative hobbies and then your professional side is sort of more serious and political.
Well, I haven't actually gotten into politics. I was in the legal world for a while and then recruiting and was laid off due to COVID. So it's just me and my hobbies now. That's
the way it should. That's me too. So I think everyone's finding that they're in the same boat, aren't they, during this strange year that we're all being exposed to. But you mentioned that you were born into the Unification Church.
Yes.
So your parents were members when you were born. Did they know each other prior to joining themselves?
They did not know each other prior to the church, prior to joining the church. They had an arranged marriage by Sun Myung Moon.
Right.
And then I was born into it.
So for those listeners that might not have listened to the episode that I did on the Unification Church, or may have not listened or read anything else about the Unification Church, can you just briefly summarize? I know it's difficult when I say briefly, the core values and beliefs of the Unification Church.
Sure, I'll try to give a nutshell explanation. So the goal of the Unification Church is to establish one family under God. The way to do that is to follow Reverend Moon and his family. So the Unification Church beliefs are slightly similar to Christianity, like the culture is similar, but the major difference is that they don't believe Jesus was sent to die for his sins. They believe that Jesus was meant to have a family on earth, and that's how God would spread his lineage and the kingdom of heaven on earth through Jesus and his family. Now, we all know, spoiler alert, that Jesus died on the cross, and so the second coming of the Messiah needed to happen. And the second coming was supposedly Reverend Moon, self-proclaimed Messiah. He had, Jesus spoke to him when he was, I think, 16, so he claims, and since then started building his church. The way to connect to God's lineage and spread the kingdom of God on earth is by receiving the, quote, holy marriage blessing from Reverend Moon, and then having kids born into the movement. Now, the kids born into the movement are the full fulfillment of this ideal vision, because we are born without original sin, air quotes, original sin. And that's the gist of the belief system.
Right. So I think there's a few things there that have been interpreted from traditional scripture that obviously that make the Unification Church stand out amongst most traditional branches of Christianity. Most notably, the things you mentioned about Jesus Christ. But also another thing that I found during my research that is particularly unique to the Unification Church is the size of the arranged marriages that happened, and I think still happen, even though Sun Myung Moon is longer here, which I'm excited for you to tell us all about. So when your parents, their marriage was arranged, was it arranged by other family members, or was it arranged by Sun Myung Moon? And how did your parents respectively join the church? Did they ever speak to you about how they found themselves as first generation members of the Unification Church?
Sure. So I'll start with how they joined and then progress to
sorry, that was so many questions.
That's okay. I threw a lot of information at you initially. Okay. So in the 70s, they were witnessed to on the street. My mom was living in Oakland at the time, and I think someone came up to her and invited her to some kind of youth dinner. And she just loved the energy of the young people, and they love bombed her, right? This is one of the methods of cults, is to just love bomb people who come in to their group or to their presentations or whatever, and to the point that they feel obligated. Well, they feel loved, and then they feel obligated to stay. My mom was at a particularly low point in her life. And it took me 27 years to get this story out of her.
Right. Okay.
About her life before the church. She was just broken. Her family had kind of disowned her, and she felt so accepted and drawn into this like young familial atmosphere, and just totally submitted to it. Mm-hmm. Was manipulated to submit to it, of course. And my dad was just in school. He was in college, I think in LA at the time. And they had a bunch of people on campuses, and he was witness to, and he's still really vague about why he joined. I can't get a clear story. They're both involved still. Right. So they're very protective of their faith. Mm-hmm. But he was witness to on a college campus. So that's how they joined. And then they were just in the church full time. They moved to houses that the church owned, and they would fundraise and witness full time. It just became their entire life. Their schedule was controlled. What they ate was controlled. How they dressed. They were required to be totally abstinent. Everyone was a brother or a sister until you were married. And so marriages were arranged by Reverend Moon himself, and only him. He's the only one who could do it. And you had to go in person to be arranged at that time. And also you had to, I just remember this, you had to receive permission from your like fundraising team leader or whoever was your like spiritual elder at the time, in order to go to the marriage blessing, like to the matching ceremony. And there were other requirements as well. I think you had to do you had to have 3 spiritual children, people who you witnessed to and brought into the church and like signed a membership. You had to, I think, fast a total of like 7 to 21 days or something. Other people who nerd out super hard on the actual rules of all of this might correct me on that. But there was some fasting requirement and a witnessing requirement. And so people who met those requirements and then got permission to receive a spouse would go to the matching. And there were typically hundreds of people. And the women would be on one side and the men would be one side. And Reverend Moon would just walk. So you'd be in a huge room somewhere. Mm-hmm. And he would be there and everyone would be there. And he would just walk down, between the men and the women and just point, you and you together. And you would leave. And that's usually the first time you met that person, unless you had met them crossed at some point at church or something. But typically you didn't know anyone. You didn't know your spouse. And he was obsessed with like interracial marriages. So there are tons of second generation kids who are half Japanese, half American. Mm-hmm. And, for the purpose of like breaking down barriers and creating one family under God, therefore, interracial blessings were necessary.
Right. Yeah. I remember reading something that Sun Myung Moon had said about his entire kingdom on earth, which meant infiltrating the other religions with Unification Church members until the world was united under his vision and thus reborn without original sin.
Right.
But it's so interesting to hear you speak about it, because I've seen so many pictures of the red carpets and the red steps and the red chairs, and then there's
and
just
the crowns.
And the crowns, and everybody when Sun Myung Moon comes out on stage, and there's this euphoria in the room that erupts. But then during the wedding ceremony, the whole room is just a flood with hundreds of people dressed in white, and that against the red carpets and everything it's like if any of our listeners haven't seen the pictures, just go and Google Unification Church, because so many pictures will come up of just this. It's almost like The Handmaid's Tale, but like reversed. Just all the white men and women's wedding dresses and suits, and it's definitely something. It's definitely a spectacle, isn't it?
It's absolutely a spectacle. Who else gets married with like hundreds or thousands of other couples at the same time?
They've never ever met, most likely, before.
Who've never met, most likely, before. Right. So I'm pretty sure the church is in the Guinness Book of World Records for the largest movement during the time of its founder, or largest religious movement, and then biggest mass wedding. For example, my parents were married at Madison Square Garden in 1982, and there was a total of 2,075 couples.
Whereabouts did your dad grow up? Was it anywhere near Oakland, or did your mum and dad find themselves, when they were matched by Sun Myung Moon, did they have to relocate, either of them, or did they happen to be sort of in the same similar areas?
So my dad grew up between Hawaii and San Diego, and then ended up going to college, I think, in San Diego or LA.
Right.
My mom is from the Midwest. She grew up in Kansas City and then moved out to San Francisco with a boyfriend. And then, wherever a matching ceremony was taking place, you would just go there. And usually it was in New York, I think. And so, all the members would go to New York to attend the matching. So, at that time, you would be matched, and then often you wouldn't see your spouse for another 5 to 7 years, as a quote condition to offer up your Isaac or your most important thing to God, so that when you actually start your family together, you were starting at the most holy spiritual place possible. But really, I think and this is the theory of many second gen I know, he prevented people from having sex for the first 5 to 7 years of their marriage so that they could continue fundraising. They had no obligations to their children or their family. They could still go out and sleep in vans and make a bunch of money for the movement. Yeah.
That's so interesting. That's definitely something about the Unification Church that I wasn't aware of. I thought that they just sort of married off hundreds of people and then that was it. They went off together, sort of hand in hand, and then had the journey of getting to know each other's names, meeting the in-laws.
Only thing I think usually there weren't any in-laws.
Of course, especially if it's I mean, I suppose you may have had some in-laws to meet, but that's a story for later on in our conversation.
We'll get to that later. That's another big story. So they would typically meet, and there would be a 3-day ceremony. And the 3-day ceremony, I've avoided looking into this further. So what I know is just from bits and pieces from different first generation members who talk about it as if it was, super spiritual and amazing. You would basically take turns abusing each other physically, for the purpose, it's the whole, what's the word in Catholicism where you would just whip, really extreme,
with a cat o' nine tails on the back.
Yes. But you're doing that to your spouse, and I don't really understand what the purpose of that was, but
wow,
it was part of some purification process for the marriage. Often they would hit each other with wooden paddles,
and this is upon their marriage to one another.
Right. Yes. There would be a 3-day ceremony.
That's so strange. That's also something that I didn't come across in my research. So they would have this ceremony.
There are very many strange, ceremonial, ritualistic things about this church that are just insane.
It's so I've gone to get married. Some young moons come down the aisle. He's married me to my spouse who I've never met before, or maybe have met but didn't really know. Then we're going to beat each other up, and then we're not going to see each other for 7 years. That's so bizarre. That is so strange, especially when the entire core message of the Unification Church, from what I could gather from my research, was to start a family that has no, that is in God's true image, that has no original sin, but yet you can't do that for another 7 years, even though you've been matched with somebody in a holy place by the second coming of Christ himself.
Right.
That's part of the strange.
Major cognitive dissonance in this religion is that it's really a business. At the end of the day, it's a huge business. The family is just wealthy for several lifetimes. And everything they did was to make more money and, build a profit for the family to live off of, from my understanding. But they would pitch that to the members as spiritual practices, as ways for them to achieve some higher spirituality by going out and fundraising. That's a spiritual practice. Beating your spouse, that's a spiritual practice. Not seeing them for 5 to 7 years and being celibate is a spiritual practice. There are many things like that make absolutely no sense, but that the members were so manipulated to believe were good for them.
Yeah, there was definitely a lot of things that I read about, and testimonies and interviews that I watched on YouTube and other places about people who were happy to give their lives and their finances and all of their time over to the Unification Church, because that was the movement that was better than any other movement out there. If you were a part of the Unification Church, you were more, you had a higher status in society, you were more powerful, I'm not saying that these things were actually true, but the members at the time, around sort of the 70s and 80s, definitely seemed to believe that.
Totally. They thought they had the truth. They had the second coming of the Messiah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Which is something that I have heard so much in the last week, and not about some young moon, but about 5 or 6 different people.
Yes.
Which is so hard for me to wrap my head around. And I keep thinking at the moment, because next month I'm doing Jehovah's Witnesses for the whole month. So I've spoken to so many people lately.
What a month.
And I'm starting to worry about what if one of these people is right at the end of all of this, and I'm sat here and disregarded them. What if it is some young moon? What if it is, what if Jehovah is really waiting? So
right.
I don't truly think that I believe in any of those things, but you hear it over and over again, and you do start to wonder, maybe one day one of these people is going to be telling the truth. And I suppose,
well, who knows?
Yeah. And then I start to think to myself, well, people say I would never believe anything that a cult was trying to sell me. But if I'm sitting here just doing research and having those thoughts on my own, if you're surrounded by a whole room of people who are so loving and so happy and accepting, and they're all saying, do you know what? This is the one person. He is the one person that is going to save us from the end of the world. We're going to be wiped of all our sin, our original sin that we can't help being born with because of Adam and Eve. You're all born with sin because of Adam and Eve, and I'm going to change all of that. And I imagine that must be so overwhelming. And
yeah, especially for people who are in an extremely vulnerable point in their life. Cults typically target people like that. People who are suggestible and who will just kind of take any scrap of attention and love. And I don't think anyone intentionally joins a cult. It seems from a lot of the first gen I've spoken to over the years, they join a replacement family. And this family keeps you in this family.
Yeah.
And they teach you that Reverend Moon and his wife are your true parents, quote, true parents, right? And the true family is your true family ordained by God. This was your truth. And it seems that a lot of first gen interpret their struggles in life and their abandonment by their own family as preparation to receive the Messiah. And so when they think they've met this amazingly charismatic person and all these young people, this must be the place to be. They're accepting me into this world. Oh my God, this is where I want to be. So
yeah, absolutely.
I don't think it's intentional. It's like Steve Hassan talks about this, that, undue influence, and it's hard to recognize when you've been under undue influence if they use methods like love bombing.
Yeah, and he talks a lot about being, sleep deprived himself when he was in the Unification Church. So for anyone who may not have listened to many of my episodes or be familiar with the Unification Church or cults in general, there is a cult expert called Stephen Hassan who was actually quite a high-ranking member of the Unification Church at one point. And he was out, I think he was selling flowers, I believe, with a team that he was in charge of. And he hadn't slept for many, many hours, which I think he speaks about. He could have gone to sleep because he was a higher ranking member within his group, but he thought, well, I'm not going to send my team out all night and not stay out all night selling flowers with them. So he stays out with them. Then they actually end up in a car accident because he hasn't had enough sleep, and it's in the hospital that his family managed to speak to him and say, you were in a cult. And he says, of course I wasn't, you're being ridiculous. But then he gets that cognitive dissonance, and that's, and after some deprogramming manages to start to doubt. And sometimes it's just that little seed of doubt that you need. So and then Stephen Hassan from that went on to become I'd say probably the world's leading expert in cult deprogramming and cult control over members within these types of sects. So it's definitely interesting, and love bombing is something that he speaks about quite a lot, and it definitely, I think at first it's easy for people to say, no, I would never join a cult. I'd be able to tell it was a cult. But I say this a lot as well, it's very intelligent, strong-willed people that I often speak to who are involved in these movements, right? Who just, like you've spoken about,
sucked in.
Yeah, in these periods of transition, or vulnerability, or grieving, or some kind of financial distress. So yeah, it's the more I read about it, the more I realize actually for people in those situations, I don't think it would be difficult at all to be drawn into that kind of movement that's going to exploit you and manipulate you. But
but I want to touch on or emphasize something you just crossed, which
absolutely.
was sleep deprivation. This is something I experienced as well. My parents experienced and I experienced. So in my parents' generation, it was much more extreme. They would sleep at most 5 hours a night.
Right.
And you were guilted if you were well rested, or if you slept extra. And there was a morning tradition called hundoke, which is reading Father's words, reading Reverend Moon's words, and starting the day with a little morning church service. And when your sleep is so consistently interrupted, you just don't have the same power of mind that you normally have. And Steve Hassan spoke about this as well. When he started to feel well rested, he felt a little more of his own resolve and self come back to him. And I felt this too. So at some point, I was part of a church school, which we might also talk about more later, but they practiced this sleep deprivation. And we were required to get up at 5 o'clock every morning for a morning service and, bow to the picture of true parents and then read their words and, sit there for however long the speaker decided to talk, which could be, anywhere from 10 minutes to 2 hours. And, then go back to sleep for another hour or two before study time. And when you just don't have energy and your brain hasn't refreshed enough, you are totally susceptible to more influence.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And then, as you said, you're having this sort of mini service in the morning where it's the faces of Reverend and Mrs. Moon that you're seeing in the morning. Then you're going back to sleep for an hour or two where most likely, the freshest thoughts in your mind are going to be on the scripture you've listened to or the faces you've seen. And then you wake up and you go, straight to school, did you say?
Yeah, well, it was a boarding school and we did online homeschool.
Right. Okay.
There. So we would just go to our desk and start studying by 8 o'clock in the morning or something.
Right. So yeah, you're not getting a chance to, have any independent thought there whatsoever because all your time is being taken up by, the face of Reverend Moon. And I can't equate to that at all. The only sleep deprivation that I can really speak to is when our baby was first born and you go into this sort of like 2 weeks of sort of having an hour's sleep here and there, and it's almost like you go into autopilot and you're thinking about you're going to sterilize those bottles and then make sure that you feed the baby every time the baby needs feeding and change the baby, and it's almost like you just go into this sort of trance. So I can imagine that it's the same for people who are getting this broken sleep. They're just kind of like, okay, then it's study, then it's a service, then we go for dinner, then we say this prayer, and it's almost like you're just in that trance, like almost zombie state where your brain is just kind of ticking over without any complex thought because you're too tired to reach that level.
Right. It's zero complex thought. That was a wonderful analogy. You just get into this kind of zone and you have very limited cognitive space for anything other than what's constantly put in front of you.
Yeah.
And the highest priority becomes your only priority. And you can't really think about doing anything else.
Yeah.
We would start the day with morning service and end the day with morning service. And before each meal, someone would make a plate for true parents and set it aside. And then, each meal is every part of the day is begun and ended, bookended with the church and that priority of like serving the family and serving God. Totally.
And you mentioned that you have some siblings that have also since left the Unification Church as well.
Yeah. My older brother was the first one out. I think when he was 18 or 19. I followed several years later when I was about 22. And my younger brothers also left around the same time that I did. A lot of people left around the same time that I did.
And did your older brother ever attempt to have a conversation with you about his life after the Unification Church in an attempt to kind of bring you out of it, or did he kind of let you reach that decision on your own?
He was a huge, powerful part of why I left. Absolutely. So this is a huge story, but I will try to give a nutshell. So I became close with some of the members of the family, particularly one of the spouse-in-laws, and was kind of recruited to help him sell this like liquid nutrition product, which was a network marketing scheme. And I was like one of his right-hand people, like traveling around the country, selling the product. Before he would get to the sales pitch about the product, he would talk for 2 to 4 hours about the True family and their story of suffering and his own story of suffering and ill health, and how this product helped them feel better and helped him feel better. And so we would truck around the country selling this product to broke church members. All of them are entirely broke. Whatever money they have, they typically gave it to the church. And we went to Hawaii, where my older brother was living at the time and still lives. And he was giving this presentation to the members. And my brother was sitting next to me, and I was just so excited to see him. I was like, my brother's here. Yes. And he turns to me at one point and goes, no matter what happens, I love you. I was like, oh, okay, what's about to happen? And so we're sitting here watching this presentation about the product, and he turns to me and says this and then starts walking towards the front of the room. And I was like, oh my God, what's happening? And he takes a folding chair, and there's this table of product next to this guy, the in-law, and he takes the chair and smashes the table full of product. And he goes, you all are being brainwashed. This is a lie. This man is manipulating you. There's no real truth here. You all don't know what you're listening to, and you need to wake up. Wake up. All of you need to wake up. This is a lie. And I'm sitting there like, I still have like a reaction to it. I'm like just petrified that this is happening. But also like my brain was like, oh my God, my brother is saying this, my older brother, who I always like looked up to and admired. He's saying this. Oh my God. And then he just left.
No, it didn't give you an explanation or anything. He just
no.
Oh my
So
goodness.
I talked to him later that day, and I told the spouse-in-law, they were like, try to get the little team who we were traveling with and this guy, the in-law to the family. We'll call him Jimmy. Jimmy was like, try to get your brother to come have dinner with us. And so I called my brother and I was like, hey, can I just meet up with you? And he goes, you're being brainwashed. You're not thinking for yourself. I was like, I'm thinking for myself, I swear. Not really believing it. And he goes, I saw Jimmy in the bathroom like taking some pills or coke or something. That man is on drugs, and he is just manipulating these people into buying this product. And I was like, oh, what? And so I went back to Jimmy and our group, and they're like, it's gonna be okay. He's just, an angry person, and he's trying to be macho and be better than me. And I was like, this doesn't make sense. And so I think a month or so after that, I ended up leaving. But he was a huge wake up call to me during that time.
In that initial moment,
yeah,
with you being obviously so closely involved in the church, did you have the thought that your brother was actually the crazy one?
That I can recall, no, because I have so much love and care for him, and I was like, I just wanted to understand what was happening. Like, why would he do this? What is his reasoning? He's always been someone I admire. Why would he do this? There has to be some reason. But the reason I didn't think would be, because Jimmy was doing coke in the bathroom, or because this was actually a lie. I thought it might have been something else, anything else. And so there was definitely cognitive dissonance there. And I think my leaving was also a long time coming, because Jimmy was extremely manipulative, super paranoid, and I had just really been feeling dissociated from myself. And, wondering, seeing so many red flags in his behavior and how he treated me personally. Jimmy, not my brother. And at one point just going, I'm not me anymore. I'm not a person. I'm just this weird personality that's been shoved onto me. And it's time to get out of here, because I don't know what's going on in my head anymore.
Yeah, well, good for your brother.
Yes, super good for my brother. Yeah.
And what's your relationship been like with your brothers since you've all left the movement?
It's been equal parts challenging and good, because we're all trying to deal with the same trauma, and our parents are still in the church. And so it's been strange because of that, but also I think we're a lot more honest with each other.
Yeah.
And want to eventually get us all back together.
Yeah.
But it's been challenging, for sure.
You said before that your parents are still very protective of the faith, and do you think that when you try to speak to them about these things, that they're skeptical of your intentions because you're no longer a believer of the church?
Probably. I just try not to speak to them as much as possible, because if we talk about anything beyond surface practicalities, conversation just totally devolves. So probably they're skeptical. My dad is very upset that none of his kids believe in God anymore. And I don't know. I never ask them if they're skeptical. I don't try to convince them to leave.
Do they ever try to convince you to come back?
For a while, yes. Yes, they definitely hoped we would come back and be part of the whole movement again. Mm-hmm. And I've made it very clear that will not be happening for me.
Yeah, I suppose now that there must be third generation members as well.
Yeah. Because I don't really know much about them, but
yeah, which is strange. And then I often wonder how cults can live from generation to generation, but with this type of movement that is all having arranged marriages and encouraging people to start families, then I suppose it just it will just keep continuing on. But when you were growing up in the church, yourself and your brothers, what did the average day? Well, we've spoken a little bit about, sort of the wake up and bedtime routine, but what did the average day and week look like with boarding school thrown in there as well?
Sure. Well, we went to public school. Some kids I know went to church schools their whole life, but we grew up in LA and went to public school there and went to public school in Hawaii. And a typical day would kind of be like the typical day of any kid. We'd wake up and go to school and come home, and maybe the salient difference would be in the evening. I think my mom would try to have like an evening service with us and like a closing prayer for the day. And we would have rituals around celebrations. So for birthdays, we would have, a specific way to do things. We would go to church absolutely every single Sunday. There was no such thing as missing church. During summers, we would often go to summer camps that were a week or 2 weeks long, which for second gen, a couple years older than me, were just hellish. Lectures from early morning to evening, punishments for being 2 minutes late, punishments like holding a squat for an hour or doing duck walks for 20 minutes.
Yeah, I've read quite a lot about stress positions being used in different types of movements like this, and it can actually have a long-standing physical effect on the body years after people have been subjected to it. So that must have been difficult.
Yeah. Like my friends who I would hang out with outside of school were church people, and my mom really tried to keep it that way. She would kind of like grill me what I would talk about with my friends at school. And there's a very strict culture of like no dating, no sex before marriage. Even talking about boys was a crime. And my mom would ask me, "Did you talk about boys today? What did you talk about with your friends?" And I would go, "Nothing. We didn't talk about anything." I was too scared to say like, "Yeah, we talked about boys. Yeah. I have crushes."
What would your mum's reaction be if you went home and said to her that you weren't talking about boys, you'd actually been talking about girls?
I have no idea. I was too scared to even say we were talking about boys. So talking about girls would probably be a whole reign of hellfire and shame. The church does not support LGBTQ people, period. One of my friends in LA, his turning point and his when he decided to leave was when his brother came out and they did not accept him. Mm-hmm. And his brother's now an incredibly successful wedding planner who's featured in like all the magazines.
Wow.
And I know
not forced to marry a woman.
Right. Yeah. Not forced to marry anyone he doesn't want to marry. And, because marriages and weddings were so depersonalized. And so he has this like personal calling to make weddings super special for people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Which is a beautiful story. Clothing was very strict, mostly for girls, of course. I couldn't wear short shorts. I couldn't really... Nothing provocative. Modesty was the name of the game. On the weekends I would only hang out with my church friends throughout high school.
These church friends, are they in the Unification Church, or are they members of different churches?
My childhood friends, I think only one of them is still kind of involved with the church. But the rest of them have left and are like typically non-religious.
Right.
Most second gen who leave tend to be agnostic. Some of them will join Christian churches. It's like what's that Hillsong? You know, that they're like all about music and praise music and youth. But for the most part, don't join any other church.
Right. And I know that a lot of the immediate family lived within sort of the DC area. So is this where you were based as well?
So our family lived in LA, where there was a big congregation. And then we moved to Hawaii in 2002. There's a much smaller group there. It's mostly older people and then really young couples with babies. And then I lived in Bay Area, where there was a big group of people as well. Like Oakland was one of the beginning centers. And then I moved to New York, which was like the biggest hub. Like the family owned a ton of huge properties around there. And they did a lot of their biggest early witnessing efforts around there. They own the New Yorker Hotel. They did their blessings at Madison Square Garden. So I had at some point lived in all those places.
And so the sort of that area was the bit, and that's where a lot of Unification Church members congregate.
Yeah.
That would you say that that's the biggest area across the world?
New York?
Yeah.
I'm honestly not sure. I know in the States it's the biggest. New York is the biggest. The New York, New Jersey, DC were definitely the biggest groups. As like I know there was a huge population of members in Japan. I don't know how many were in Korea, but Japan had a lot of people, and they would send missionaries to the States as well.
And when you were growing up within the church, are there any particular notable experiences that you can remember that an average child may not have had growing up with a typical childhood?
I think there are probably many. Can you give me a few examples that you might be thinking of or that you've encountered?
Yeah. So I was just speaking to an ex-Jehovah's Witness the other day, and they were talking about how they don't celebrate birthdays or holidays. And for Jehovah's Witnesses that go to traditional schools where a birthday cake is brought out to the birthday boy or girl or person in the classroom, and everyone sings happy birthday, and this person will sit there and they won't join in. So that to me is an experience that's not typical of an average child.
Sure. So, well, I guess I could talk. I think there are so many different strange rituals that I've actively tried to forget, but let me see if I could pull some out for you. Birthdays were, everything was a holy ceremony, and it was very serious. Birthdays, you would start the morning with what's called an offering table. So there would be, this is similar to a lot of Eastern religions, where you would have like an offering table for Buddha, or you would have, candles and treats and things put on the table as like a, giving the best to whatever higher power you believe in. So we would do that on birthdays. There would be an offering table of like fruits and candies and cake. And then our parents would, we were supposed to wear all white. My parents would wear all white, and I would usually wear whatever I want. And they would put their hands over our head and pray. And as if, I am also an offering to God. Like, I am not their child, I am God's child.
Right. And
we would usually say what's called the family pledge. And this pledge would be used at other holidays as well. It was, I think, 10 different points of pledging our absolute faith, absolute love, and absolute obedience to God and to true parents. And We would say this on birthdays. We would say it on God's Day, which was New Year's Day. We would say it on anything else we were celebrating. We would start with a family pledge. We would bow to the picture of true parents, and then we would, say the pledge all together. And so that's probably an experience that most kids don't have, is like,
I'd say that's definitely something that I think is not typical of an average child's upbringing.
Yeah,
it's just very interesting, I think, for myself and my core listener base who come back every week, who I absolutely adore and love, and thank you so much to all those people.
Listener base.
I think that's what is interesting, is trying to imagine growing up with these rituals, and they'd be so different to the experiences that we had growing up.
Sure. And I'm sorry to overrun you there. There are a few more that come to mind.
Yeah, absolutely. No, please, I'll just talk. So you have to cut me off, and you have to tell your story. Otherwise, I'll sit here going, "Oh, yeah."
Well, arranged marriage is one of them. I had an arranged marriage for 10 months. We had a very strict us versus them mentality. So anything not really church related, or that you were doing that wasn't for the greater purpose of restoring the world to its original pure state, was pointless. So no dating at all. I think this is common among a lot of extreme religions. You have to marry someone within your religions. Like I mentioned, I had to have arranged marriage. We had a 3-foot rule, so you could not be within 3 foot of someone of the opposite sex. No hand holding, no hugging, no kissing, no touching, period. Boys and girls separated. We didn't have any specific clothes we were supposed to wear, but girls really, really strict, like modesty. Was part of a church school for the last year and a half of high school, and whenever we would go to the beach, the modesty rules for girls were so severe. Like, we had to wear basketball shorts and t-shirts, and the boys could just run around with their shirts off. We did you catch the part about the 3-foot rule?
Yeah.
Okay. Also, every family home had a picture of true parents, usually a big picture. My mom is particularly a Unification warrior, so she has pictures of true parents in her wallet. She has them in the car. She has them in every single room of the house. And, if we ever had friends come over who were non-church people, they would ask us, who are those Korean people? Like, who are those Asian people? And my older brother would say those are his grandparents.
Oh, of course. Yes, because the different ethnicities. Yeah. So be like, who are those Asian people all over your house?
Right. So for listeners who can't see me, I'm a very typical looking American lady. So having pictures of old Asian people is awkward.
and because they often, in the pictures they have taken of them as well, are in very luxurious traditional Korean attire as well.
Yes. So yeah,
with the headdresses and the
hanbok, which is like the women's dress.
Yes. Yep. So I can imagine that is strange when you have friends come round. Did you ever have an experience like that where you had a friend to come round the house and they weren't a member of the Unification Church?
Sure. And I was, I think, relatively open with my friends that I was really religious. I wouldn't go into depth about the religion. Also, kids don't care that much. And no one my age has usually heard of the Moonies. So I'd say, hey, you heard of the Moonies? yeah, it's Christian based. And then they would come over and see this picture of this old Asian couple in extravagant Korean attire and go, who are those people? And I'd say, those are the leader of our church. And typically that's where the conversation would end.
Not sure kind of where to go next or what to ask.
Yeah.
Oh, and for listeners who also might not be aware of the Unification Church, they are nicknamed the Moonies because of some young Moon and Mrs. Moon. Although I do believe that is not a term that practicing members of the church appreciate.
Right, especially the first generation, because it was used derogatorily when they were first joining and witnessing around New York. And people, I read this recently, people would actually moon the Moonies.
Oh, no way!
Which is brilliant.
People around New York would just get their butts out to
especially like around the properties in Tarrytown. They would pull their pants down.
That is funny. I mean, imagine doing it to somebody you think is a Mooney and then they turn out to just be an average person on the street and they're like, what's going on? So you've spoken about bringing friends home and having church friends outside of the church. Did you have any hobbies or classes or anything that you attended did you pick up an instrument or have something that was for yourself that was not focused on the Unification Church?
Yeah, I mean, my parents had us in like recreational sports. They were pretty good about that, but we didn't really socialize with the kids after. And my mom is super musical. She was part of the church choir. She was like a piano orchestral accompany. What's the term? She would accompany the orchestra by playing piano in high school before the church. And so music has always been a part of her life and in the church as well. She still plays piano for the church every Sunday. And well into her late 60s, still playing. And so we definitely got the musical bug. I took piano lessons, and after leaving the church, I took voice lessons as well. But when I was younger, my two of my brothers, well, all my brothers, we all play guitar. But one of them got guitar lessons, and one played clarinet, and the other played saxophone. And so music was a big part of our life. And fortunately, that wasn't oppressed, but it was treated with praise only to the point that, like, okay, now go play for church.
Right.
Okay, now use that to, and even if that wasn't said explicitly, it was implied covertly. And there was always some twinge of guilt or shame if we weren't doing that.
Yeah.
And my parents would try to pay for music lessons, but then say, like, send us a recording or send us something so we can show all our friends. And it was never just for us. It was always for them, the church, or other people. Everything we did had to be for the sake of others. One of the biggest cultural points of being a Unification Church member is to live for the sake of others. Live for the sake of others before you take care of yourself. So really die for the sake of others. And everything you had to do was in service to someone else. Like, if to this day, sometimes I feel like if I'm doing something I enjoy, I'll be enjoying it and then go, oh, well, like, what's the bigger purpose of drawing this picture or singing this song? And, because of that, it's not for someone else. I'm doing this for me now, which is not how we were raised.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people who come out of these movements, they talk a lot out of these movements, often find themselves years down the line having a split second of feeling guilt or second guessing something they're doing because of the repercussions that they might get from their leaders or parents or people involved, and then remember, that was years ago.
They can't do anything to me anymore.
That
cycle you just explained is kind of a constant cycle, and probably one I will have for the rest of my life, since the indoctrination began from the point I was born. Same with my brothers. We deal with that
Absolutely,
same.
yeah. And I guess that's why it's a bit difficult for you and your brothers to find, just to be purely happy when you're with one another, because
Right.
you're always going to be reminded of all of these experiences every time you're with each other.
Right.
But at the same time, it's also good to be able to have people to discuss those experiences with, especially when it comes to the gaslighting side of things, because you can say to one of your brothers, when that time we went here and we did that did actually happen, didn't it? And do you remember that? Or am I just thinking that happened and it never actually happened? So it's good in that sense as well, that you have people to share your memories with and talk through for therapeutic reasons. And
I think one of the a similar vein of conversation would be, oh, that really happened and it was my fault, and then we would all go, no, that was not your fault, that was someone else. Because like part of the indoctrination, I think, especially for early members, is like making your problems your fault. Like, if someone would start to question what was happening, they would turn it back on you and say, oh, do you have a problem trusting me? Do you have a problem with trust?
Are you second guessing some young Moon's words? Are you saying that he's not a prophet?
Right.
I'm just confused. Just talk me through this. Why are you? It's really uncomfortable when you hear people's like recounts of those things happening, because it's a real thing, and it's not just cults that happens. People will experience these in abusive relationships, and so if anybody
with anyone who's like pathologically narcissistic, that's what happens.
So if anybody is having those small bits of doubts, or they're being second guessed, and you're having those types of conversations, definitely go and look up something like 12 signs that you're being gaslit, or 12 signs that you're being manipulated, because you never know, you could be, and we don't want anybody in those situations.
Steve Hassan's bite model is wonderful for you to figure out whether you are being manipulated. Daniel Shaw wrote this amazing book called Traumatic Narcissists. Oh, I didn't start my video. Traumatic Narcissists, relational systems of subjugation. And if you ever feel like you're right, but you were made to feel like you're wrong, and you just have that gut feeling that what's right, go read these books.
Definitely
They will help validate you.
So your mum, she sounds like she's a very proud member of the Unification Church.
Oh my goodness, yes. So recently she bought, I let them use my Amazon account, and recently she bought some church paraphernalia.
Right.
And I had to say, do not use my Amazon account to buy church products.
Can you explain what those types of paraphernalia are? If I look up Amazon now, will I be able to find some for myself?
Oh yeah. Typically they're books. So Reverend Moon and his wife have hundreds and hundreds of books. The majority of literature in our house was and is church books about their life, books about the core doctrine, the divine principle.
He's got an autobiography here,
got an autobiography. His wife has an biography or autobiography, and they're mostly books.
Oh yeah, here it is. The Exposition of the Divine Principle.
Yeah.
I can't. Oh, hang on. Let me have a look. Kindle edition. Oh wow! So I could buy it leather bound for £43.
Oh God.
Or paperback for 26. So I suppose it depends how fancy you want to be.
Yeah. Well, when I was still in the church, I think when I was 15 or 16, a book called The Chunsangyang came out, and it's like this whopping 2,500 page book that they sold for like $1,200 or something. Yeah, it was insane.
Oh, here's one. God's warning to the world. Reverend Moon's message from prison. So Does this refer to his prison stretch where he was stayed in not a concentration camp, but he was detained on some type of camp years back?
Yeah, he was in prison several times.
And then went to prison for, interestingly,
tax evasion.
I think there was another one where he was caught being unfaithful.
Yes, adultery.
And trying to carry out some blood lineage ritual.
So he was doing what male cult leaders typically do, which, are there any female cult leaders? That would be interesting. But anyway, so what male cult leaders typically do, which is have sex with whoever they want. So that's basically what he was doing. I don't know the whole story, but I know that he was married several times before his main wife, who is still alive and leading the movement. And he was jailed for being unfaithful to her, and he was released, obviously, and then jailed a couple other times, once in the States for tax fraud and several other things.
He's actually got a number of illegitimate children, and when I read up his reasoning, when he would get caught committing adultery, because he's got a number of wives as well, I believe.
He had a total of 6 wives. Yeah.
And Mrs. Moon is seen as the true mother.
Yes.
But his other wives that have a close allegiance to the inner family were also given titles of honor, so to speak. And one of the times he got caught actually committing adultery, he claimed that he was purifying the womb of the woman he was caught having sex with.
That's what he was doing.
So that she may bear
God's children
without sin.
That's how that works, ladies.
Yeah, and also, whilst we're on the subject of scandal, a number of Sun Myung Moon's children, tragically, really, are caught up in abuse and narcotics abuse, which you mentioned, physical abuse of their wives that were also married through arranged marriage through Sun Myung Moon. And horrible stories about some of the abuse that some of these wives and one of the daughters of Sun Myung Moon was subjected to as well. And when they approached Sun Myung Moon and said, these things are happening to me, he would just basically turn around and say, you've brought these things on yourself, and it's God's will for you to be treated this way. This is your life, and this is how God wants you to be, which is just absolutely
because I said so.
Yeah, it's horrible. And then there's huge drug scandals with Sun Myung Moon's, one of his sons particularly, and then there's also illegitimate children who have been found to be Sun Myung Moon's children, who a few he has said are not his children, a few he has not commented on. So it's the entire family is it's more like reading about Hollywood superstars in the papers at the moment than talking about an extremely powerful, venerable, pure leader of one of the biggest religious movements of the 21st century.
Are you talking about Scientology?
Yeah, well, I could be. Who knows? I mean, I know they're over in LA, but I could be.
Yeah.
So with your, just going back quickly on female cult leaders, I did an episode last week on Love Has Won.
Oh.
And the leader is Amy Carlson, and she's definitely a cult leader.
Wow.
However, she was, as I believe, part of a different movement before she branched off to start her own movement. And Father God was the leader of that original movement she was a part of. Then she broke off and she started her own movement called Love Has Won, where she is Mother God. And there is also another one where I did an episode and I interviewed a wonderful woman named Helen Zuman, who has a great book that I promote every time I talk about her, called Mating in Captivity, which is available on Amazon.
Yeah.
And that movement was run by a woman called Arul, who was the matriarch of that movement, but only after her cult leader husband died and she took over.
I mean, which is where the Unification Church is now.
Yeah. So, interestingly enough.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there are some female cult leaders, but it seems to be that they actually branch off from men. Yeah. So your mum is a proud and practicing member of the Unification Church. Did they ever, were your parents ever given any extra, like, special responsibilities within the church?
The only things they did were, like, my mom would be part of the choir, or play the piano, and my dad was involved in fishing. He's a licensed fisherman. In the 80s, the church bought a fleet of boats, and so he started fishing and loved it. That's his first home, is the ocean. And the reason we moved to Hawaii in 2002 was because the church needed a captain for one of its boats. And so we moved the whole family there, and he started fishing. But anything to serve God's providence, got to do it. But that's it. Like, they didn't really have any extracurriculars,
right?
Aside from that. The church definitely demands a lot of money, and which my mom still gives into, and they actually have something similar to Catholic indulgences, which are, you could basically buy a ticket to heaven. This was this was around the time of Martin Luther. This was one of his objections in his 95 Thesis to the Catholic Church. The Unification Church doesn't sell tickets to heaven, but you can pay some spiritual person. I think there are a couple different people who do this, to go into the spirit world and restore dead people, like restore your ancestors, or restore famous people who you're worried are in hell. Like, I remember when I was like 14 or so, my younger brother was just starting to get into guitar, and we were all on a Jimi Hendrix binge, and he was like, "Can I restore Jimi Hendrix?" And it was like $40 or something. But if you want to do family members, like, it's really expensive for your immediate family members, and then it's less expensive for family members who've died longer ago. But you can pay, and my mom, I know, has like squandered tens of thousands of dollars on this
for people who are no longer here.
Yeah, for spiritual liberation, for people who are not here, people who are no longer
have
living.
Never heard of Some Young Moon.
Yeah, right. And I know a lot of other families do this too.
Right. That's interesting.
Not a lot, but enough to keep the church kind of going.
Yeah, that's also something that I hadn't come across in my research. So that's definitely another interesting point. And even though your parents weren't given particular jobs or responsibilities outside of the church, I only ask because I've watched a little bit of Teddy Hose, who's an ex-Unification Church member, speak openly on a few different documentaries, and he's also appeared on a couple of different podcasts as well about his time within the church. And his father was he talked about bowing to true parents every morning and all that stuff, and they'd come out on stage and everyone would be like, woo!
Bowing is a huge thing. I wanted to mention that when you asked like weird things that other kids wouldn't experience. Lots of bowing. to the church, to the picture in the morning or in the evening, or doing conditions of bowing for, indemnity, or to, clear your spiritual airwaves and nonsense. But anyway.
Yeah, it's interesting that he mentioned his father would go to do jobs for some young moon, and they often wouldn't see him for long periods of time, and he would explain this by saying, the true parents come first, so anything they ask of me I will do happily. But then you did have that sort of extra responsibility, I guess, by becoming so close to members of the inner circle. So with being as vague as you wish to be, or as detailed, it's completely up to you. How did that situation, how did that happen? How did you end up in that position? And was your mum particularly happy with you?
She was overjoyed.
She was over the moon.
Yeah, over the moon. Yes. She was basking in the light of the moon, rather. And so that happened. That's a bit of a long story, if you don't mind delving into
absolutely. That. You tell us everything.
Sure. Okay, so it's going to start at several steps back. So I was married. I had an arranged marriage for about 10 months. During that time, Tatiana Moon was put in charge of the church. Injin Moon was put in charge of the American church. And her whole shtick was to normalize the church for the young people and gear all the Sunday services more towards the young people. Right. And she encouraged people to go to school and to be like a real person in the world, which was and to have like normal relationships with the opposite sex. So she brought in ballroom dancing and all these wonderful things that kind of helped us normalize our teen and young adult angst. And Sunday services involved rock music. So she revolutionized a lot of things. And she went around the country, like touring around the country to meet all the young people and just to hear what they're doing and what they want to do in life. So I was in the church school at the time and married to someone. And he came to the church school and lived there, and we got up on stage together in front of her. So imagine a full church hall. Everyone's there. There's a line of young people at the stage, and she's sitting in the front row just listening to everyone's story. And I have to get up there with this guy I was married to, and it was pretty clear I was extremely miserable at that time. And also the person I was married to clearly had some mental deficiencies like Asperger's or some kind of social autism. And she could see how miserable I was. But what I expressed to her was like, I love arts. I want to go to art school. What you're doing with Sunday services is cool because you're including animations and all these interesting things. And she told me, she noted, you look miserable, but you're ambitious and smart. And so we, got up there, said our thing, left. A couple weeks later, she and her and Jimmy call me, and they're like, how are you doing? Are you okay? And I'm like, why are you calling me? Yeah, I'm great. And they kind of kept tabs on me for a little while. And she invited me to come to New York. And I was like, why is she inviting me to come to New York? And it was really to talk about my marriage, because she saw how miserable I was, and she met this guy and saw how deficient of a person he was. And just not marriage material for me. And the pressure I was getting at the time from all the people, all the adults in the church school, was that suffering is good for you, and it's great that you're in this difficult marriage. And I was like, this doesn't make sense. I'm miserable. I've done all the right things in my life, and I get this. And the message I received, but that's a good thing, and you'll understand your suffering later. And she saw that and recognized it, flew me to New York and said, you have a choice. She said, you have a choice to either stay with this marriage or have a life of faith and become closer to God, if that's what you want to do, or you can leave it and pursue a more like a career and have more of your own life. And she was the first person to ever tell me I have a choice. And so at the time, hearing that from her, right, someone who I've revered my whole life, telling me that I don't have to accept the match that her father gave me, which is like the purpose of life, was like, mind explode. And so she saved my life from that.
Right. And this is Unjin, you mentioned.
Injin.
And she went on to actually leave the church, I think did she came out and spoke against her father at some point, and
different daughters.
Right, okay.
Yeah. But you're correct about Unjin. She did do that.
Right.
She's back in it now, though.
Oh. I know one of the daughters came out and spoke about how she was being physically abused by her husband.
That was the spouse of the oldest son, Nansuk. She wrote a book, and one of the daughters, Unjin, backed her up.
Yes, that's it.
Right.
And so this person helps you.
She saved my life from this horrifyingly terrible marriage and said, why don't you come to New York and intern for me at the ministry that we have in New York?
Right.
So that's when I left my marriage, moved to New York, and her husband just kind of kept an eye on me. Like, I got involved in evening youth programs. Like, there was a youth program every Wednesday. I started singing in the band. I started open mics there so people could perform music or comedy or whatever they wanted. And then we started doing ballroom socials as well. And he just noticed that I was a capable, organized person and recruited me to help him with this network marketing scheme. And I thought, I hate sales, but I feel obligated to be part of this. She saved my life. Of course I'll help her husband.
Right. So this arranged marriage.
Yeah.
You said that Some Young Moon actually paired you together. So talk us through sort of going from not being married to finding out you're going to be married and the entire process.
Sure. So I was in the church school and not married, and there was a matching coming up. And of course, there's this pressure that you get married as early as you can. So I think I was 18 at the time. And the only option for me and anyone else in the United States was to send in your picture to Korea, where Reverend Moon would then match pictures together, and you would receive your spouse by mail, a picture in the mail. And so I've thought okay, it's the right thing to do. This is the whole point of all of this. I'll put my picture in. I think I pulled it out and put it back in a couple times because I just had this this is the right thing to do, but oh my God, it's such a big responsibility, but it's the right thing to do. And everyone says it's a good thing. And this is the whole purpose of life. But I'm not ready, but pressure. So I put in my picture and then, received the picture of who I was to be, blessed to.
And how did you become actually officially married to that person? And I mean, were you living in completely different areas? how did that next go after receiving his picture?
Sure. So we received the picture. I was living in Columbus at the time, Columbus, Ohio at the time. And he was also living in Columbus, Ohio, which was extremely rare to, one, be matched to someone in the same country, to two, be matched like in the same city. So then he came to the church school. He wasn't really doing anything with his life, and he came to stay at the church school. And
so did he contact you to tell you that he was going to come over to your church school?
I think I contacted him. Well, okay. So let me back up a little bit. So we received the picture, and I think a couple weeks later, there was a blessing ceremony in New York where a couple hundred couples got together, and Reverend Moon was in Korea, so his youngest son, who now runs a sect of the church in Pennsylvania, who they love guns, he was presiding over the ceremony symbolically.
Right.
And so we do the whole marriage ceremony and then have a couple days to kind of get to know each other. And before the marriage ceremony, just had a huge emotional breakdown. And I was like, I don't think I should be doing this. And my mom was with me. And the message she gave me was, if you don't do this, your whole ancestors and your lineage will suffer. Because
that's a huge amount of pressure. That's not just I'll suffer. That's everybody.
That's everyone
ever.
else you touch will suffer.
Oof.
And I'm not the only one who received that kind of message. And I share that to kind of like get their story out there too. Like, that's the amount of guilt you would be burdened with.
Jeez, that's so much. That's a lot. So you know that you're going to meet this guy. How does it happen? Do you say, I'll be the person wearing the red jumper, I'll wait out the front of the building, and then what is it like when you actually first interact with this person who you're now married to? Right. So it's awkward, especially if you're not at all attracted to each other. If you're attracted to each other, there's at least some kind of excitement. But to be blunt, he was big, fat, and ugly, and just extremely awkward. Like, kind of the horror image of someone you would get matched to by picture. And very few people know him. So hopefully this doesn't get out there to him. But so it's awkward. It's extremely, extremely awkward. And we have a couple days to just kind of have a conversation and say what you're doing. And I was like, well, I'm at this church school. Like, do you want to come stay? And he said he would think about it. And then a month or so later, I think maybe a couple months later, he decided to come stay at the school and be like an intern at the school. And so there was always this pressure at the church school as well, which was like an extremist bubble within the bubble of the church. Right.
Like, people would just be watching me all the time. And
that's so horrible. And you're married to this person that you don't particularly get on with or like.
Yeah.
And there's the prospect of having to start a family with this person as well.
Yes, right. There was that pressure. I never consummated the marriage, couldn't bring myself to do it. Whew. But there was this pressure to kind of get a move on with that. And like, because I would be going through so much suffering, I'm going to get so much blessing later on. And it just didn't make any sense to me. And it was a big wake-up call for not a lot of other people, but a few other people who said this to me, that you were like an exemplary older sister figure, and you always did the right thing, and you always cared about people. And then, the most important thing that's supposed to happen in your life is actually the most terrible thing that's happening in your life. If someone like you gets that, is given that quote blessing, like, what's the point of all of this?
Yeah, and I mean, doesn't that just justify these people in these horrible situations that are being objected to this violence and this abuse and these awful conditions, because their suffering means that they're eventually going to be super blessed.
Yeah,
so
it's backwards.
The more abuse they receive, the better, which is just not, that's not a life for anybody. And you know, I know that there might be one or two listeners who are thinking, oh well, you shouldn't be shallow and judge somebody by the way that they look, but you've mentioned that he was a difficult and awkward person to speak to, and I do believe that if you have a good rapport with somebody, even if initially you don't find them physically attractive, there is room there to start to become attracted to the personality that somebody has.
Absolutely. Yes.
But in your case, if you've mentioned that he may have had some type of Asperger's or autism, or was not functioning in a way that you could communicate with, and that's not me saying that people with Asperger's or autism can't be communicated with, because that's just obviously so far from the truth. But if this particular person is difficult for you to build a rapport with, and on top of that, you know, you're not physically attracted to them, because humans are physically attracted to one another, and that's just that's how, you know, people hook up with each other and have one night stands and stuff, that and alcohol. But
but yes, I don't mention those things to, you know, cast aspersion upon people who have Asperger's or autism at all, but I cast those in, I say those to like draw a picture of, we were painted with this idea that your marriage is supposed to be beautiful, and you're supposed to create a God-centered family, and you know, you're a second generation without original sin, you're going to have a beautiful family, and you will probably be arranged with someone international and exotic, and you know, have a very interesting cross-cultural life. And I just, you know, those are the expectations, and I've always been a diehard romantic you know, on top of that. And, you know, being given that situation was like, this is challenging every single expectation I've been given.
Yeah, definitely. So it lasted around 10 months. You ended up close to the inner circle of the family and managed to find a way out of that situation. And then eventually went to see your brother and found a way out of the church altogether.
Yeah.
And there's just a few things you've mentioned as we've gone through, so I'm gonna go back to a few things.
Sure.
You mentioned youth dinners and summer camps, and when I listened to Teddy Ho's talk about indoctrinating new members, he spoke about camps as well. When you went away to these summer camps, were there new potential recruits at these summer camps, and were you ever responsible for bringing anybody into the movement yourself?
Fortunately, I was never responsible for bringing in new people. A huge weight off my conscience. And I don't recall there being many new members. I think the camps that I went to, maybe for my older brother, it was a little different. But for me and my younger brothers, the camps were just for second generation.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
And was there ever the opportunity for, if your parents were to meet other first generation members, and you know, you each have kids that are, I mean, can you matchmake? Can the parents matchmake, or is that not allowed?
Yeah. So at some point, shortly after Injun became in charge of the American church, she also normalized marriage. Like, your parents can find you a match, you can also find someone, which it was a really big deal because we grew up with like the only thing you can accept is an arranged marriage by Reverend Moon, and she changed all of that. So my parents attempted a couple matchings for my older brother and never for me. But that still exists a little bit. But I think people are kind of mostly finding their own people.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever have I always have these strange thoughts, either shower thoughts or just before I fall asleep thoughts. And do you ever have these moments where you wonder what would have happened if you would have waited for the next round of matching to put your photo in?
Of course, there's so many, like, what if I didn't do this? What if I did this instead? Like, one of the biggest thoughts I have is, like, the way I joined the church school, my family, the only time we ever all traveled somewhere together, we all flew to San Francisco in, like, January 2007 for this special ceremony called an Amnesty Ceremony, which is you wear all white and you hit yourself and you hit other people while chanting and singing to, like, get rid of the evil spirits that are attached to your body. You know, Casey, there are tons of little spirits just hanging on to you right now. Gotta get rid of them. And so you would just sit in these big rooms, and, you know, there would be a band on stage, like, playing music and beating drums, and you had to, like, you hit yourself. And I was just like, I'm not going to hit myself. And there were some older members who would kind of, like, come up to you and, like, want to hit you. And I'm just like, don't, just stay away. But so, we were in San Francisco, and at the time, I was still enrolled in high school in Hawaii. I was 16 and I hated school and I hated Hawaii. And my mom told me about this church school in the Bay Area where one of our, like, family friends was going, like a childhood friend of mine was attending the school, and he was, you know, one of my buddies growing up. And she said, oh, he's there. And I was like, oh, cool. So I checked out the school and I was like, yeah, I'm staying. I'm not going back to Hawaii. So I just stayed at the church school, and they had to, like, remove me from public school. And I forget why I started that story, but
I think we were talking about what if moments.
Yeah. Oh, so the what if would be like, what if I went back to Hawaii and actually stayed in school and graduated and started college at 18 instead of 22? What if I had gone to college and actually had a more normal dating life at, like, a normal age? What if I had actually chosen a major that I was interested, like, in all the hobbies I loved in high school, like graphic design or photography? Like, what if?
I mean, I'm sure there's loads of moments like that for people that have had typical lives, but it's just interesting when you talked about taking your picture out and putting it back in and going to do it and then not doing it. And I just wonder what would have happened if you would have waited for the next matching, because you could have been matched with somebody completely different and you could
might still be in it, right?
Yeah, which is a strange thought, isn't it?
Possibility.
When you spoke about food offerings and stuff, is there a particular... Now, I read during my research that the Unification Church were the biggest supplier of sushi across America.
Yes.
So when it comes to food and diets or restrictions within the are you encouraged to eat a lot of sushi?
Well, there's definite encouragement to be more Korean.
Right.
To learn the language, to eat the food, to learn the culture, to call people but with the proper suffixes, like, you know, an older brother to a younger sister, I would call an older brother Oppa,
Right.
like, Charles Oppa or something. Or an older sister would be Ani. And then for a younger boy to an older brother would be Hyung, or an older sister would be Nuna.
Right.
So there was a lot of pressure to conform to the culture in general. I don't remember particular pressure to eat sushi, but they do. Yeah, True World Foods is a huge fish supplier. My dad worked for them for a little bit. One of the church people in Hawaii still works there. Like I would see the trucks in New York too, and I'd be like, oh.
Mm-hmm. It was just like as I was doing my research, I was like, okay, I think it was is it the Washington Times they owned?
Oh,
The
yeah.
Washington, not the
Washington
Washington
Post?
Was it the Washington? It's one of them.
I don't remember.
It's one of them that I think it's either changed its name now or is no longer actually officially running. Might be the Washington. Anyway, I was like, yeah, I can kind of see that. It's a good way to spread your message. If you're getting involved in that type of thing. But then I read the thing about the sushi, and I thought, number one supplier of sushi across America. That's a strange one.
I mean, my dad was a fisherman for one of the church boats, and we would get pressure to eat fish just because we had so much of it. But like food wise, there weren't any restrictions on food.
You were married by Sun Myung Moon, so he was alive at the time. He just wasn't doing the ceremonies like your parents had. And were you still in the movement when Sun Myung Moon died?
I think that's when I was gradually separating myself.
Okay, so what was the atmosphere like, and what were the events like around his death? And like how would it have affected members like your mum, for example?
There was grieving, and I was still really conflicted about whether I was leaving the truth behind. And a lot of people fasted as like a spiritual offering to help his ascension into the spiritual world. When Sun Myung Moon died, I was still kind of figuring out where I stood in terms of my relationship to the church. Mm-hmm. So I did a 3-day fast to kind of like make some spiritual offering and just cover my ass in case he was right. Mm-hmm. But otherwise, I also had a kind of relief that he died. I think after that, the church split. Like there were several kind of sects that happened.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So it's Mrs. Moon that runs the Unification Church now. I think that she's actually changed the official name of it, or she.
Oh, has she?
Started a new branch as well as the Unification Church.
Oh.
And the youngest son that you mentioned before has his own sect that still does arranged marriages, but they just have semi-automatic weapons as they get married as well. And they're supposed to, I think they're supposed to bring their weapons with them to these mass arranged marriages, or if you cannot obtain a weapon, you're supposed to go to the gun store and get a voucher for the same amount that a semi-automatic machine gun would cost, as proof that you are that you are committed to the cause. So you have to go with some type of offering, and obviously they're getting a weapons cache prepared to fight the end of the world and to protect themselves when the inevitable end times do come. So very scary.
For anyone who is interested in looking at something completely strange and a little scary, look up that sect of the church. I don't remember what it's called, but the youngest son is called Hyungjin Moon. And it's disturbing.
I'm just gonna get the names up for them now. So what has your life actually been like in the 8 years since you left the church?
Well, I finished my master's degree, and in retrospect, that was me kind of jumping into another institution. And it was also, I wanted to get an education, and I wanted to be, have some proof that I am a normal person in the world. I also worked full-time throughout my degree. I ended up getting a scholarship for my master's, which was pretty cool. And then so I didn't really have much of a social life at that time. I was just working full-time, going to school full-time, and picked up some hobbies. I picked up salsa dancing. Loved salsa dancing. I was an addict for a while. And then I worked in a law firm for 1.5 years. I was a secretary and a pro bono coordinator as well. Hated that because it reminded me so much of the church. It was this really prestigious law firm with a very particular culture and a very clear hierarchy and leadership, and I stuck with it for 1.5 years because it paid decently, and then at one point couldn't take it anymore and quit and got myself into recruiting, and then was laid off because of COVID. So it's been quite a roller coaster of self-discovery and relearning what life means to me and who I want to be and what I want to achieve and what does success actually look like for me, with this strange upbringing, and how to have healthy relationships with proper boundaries and respect and recognition. And who do I want my friends to be? What is a friend to me? What is a family to me? What is a marriage to me? Like reconstructing what all these basic life ideas are to me. And that takes massive amounts of trial and error and panic and elation and everything in between. When, for other people listening who have been in cults or who listened to your previous episodes, being in a cult kind of robs you of your personal identity. You can't be an individual. So, I've been rediscovering my own identity and purpose in life.
I think you've summed that up beautifully from the conversations I've had from other people that themselves, whether they've distanced themselves in the last few months or years or since childhood, are going through the same motions and experiences of just trying to piece together parts of you that are your true personality and dismiss parts of you that are left there from things you were taught that no longer apply now that you're not a part of this movement. So I think that's good. I mean, have you attended any therapy at all? Is that a route that you would recommend other people in similar situations kind of trying to find their way out of the cloud, so to speak?
Absolutely go to therapy. I've been in therapy for almost 2 years. I wish I had started sooner, but it worked out the way it worked out, and I lucked out super hard with an amazing therapist. The first person I talked to, he had experiences with the therapy cult and understood where I was coming from in terms of like a cult experience. And I recommend going to therapy and finding someone who has training with cults or with traumatic narcissists, like people who've been in relationships with traumatic narcissists, pathological narcissists, etc. Yeah, absolutely. Read about cults so you can understand what it is you experienced, and the common understanding of a cult. It's not easy coming out of it, because there's this whole roller coaster of like fear that you're actually leaving the truth behind, and then, you know, determination and longing and desire to fulfill who you are as a person.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to kind of like find a peaceful middle-ish ground of like just being yourself. Therapy helps so much with that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's helped me immeasurably. I don't think I would be able to talk to you about this if I haven't been in therapy for 2 years. I also read a lot of psych resources. Psychology Today is great. It's in layman's terms. Anyone can read that. Anything on trauma helps as well.
Mm-hmm. I think that's all great advice. I mean, I don't know if you use any particular websites or forums to help it, or have come across any resources that might be particularly helpful to people.
There's the ICSA. I just became a member this week. The International Cult Studies website. They have a ton of resources on their website. Any of Steve Hassan's books on undue influence and cults. Talk to me. Find other people who've been through the same thing. If maybe you're the only person in your movement who left. I'm fortunate that a lot of second generation Unification Church members have been leaving and left around the same time that I did.
Mm-hmm.
The church really imploded around that time.
What do you think the future holds for the Unification Church now that these, you know, if people are leaving in this way? Do you envision it slowing down at any point, or do you think it will just continue to kind of bubble along?
Hopefully the Unification Church has no future. But I think it has slowly, I don't really keep tabs on it anymore. I'm guessing it has slowly decreased in its ability to influence other people, especially
Mm-hmm.
with the internet, and a large group of ex-members. There are several ex-member websites. One particularly is How Well Do You Know Your Moon, which they put a lot of facts out there about the church and
Mm-hmm.
kind of let
Mm-hmm.
you think about it. So I don't know what the future is. I wonder how they'll be able to survive with a dwindling base of
Mm-hmm.
financial support from full-time fundraisers.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to think about, because your mum might feel a bit differently if she's a practicing Mooney and she has
Right.
the pictures around the house and she's going to church every Sunday. But now that that's not your echo chamber,
Mm-hmm.
maybe there are just as many members as there has always been, but now that you've distanced yourself from it and it's not such a direct part of your life, you feel as if the world is not so caught up in the Unification Church.
Yeah.
But it, like you said,
That's what I want to believe.
Don't really know, of course, and it's like you said, we don't really know. I mean, I don't see it in the news. Well, my partner actually went to school with somebody who was a Mooney.
Like a practicing Mooney?
Yeah.
Whoa.
So that was about 15 years ago.
Where?
In London. Yeah.
Oh. Who?
I have absolutely no.
Okay.
I have absolutely no idea. But yeah, there was a brother and a sister, and the sister is now married to somebody outside of the church. So I'm guessing she left the Unification Church. But it's difficult. So I can't say I've ever met anybody. You know, I did an episode on the Hare Krishnas, and I've at least seen a group of Hare Krishnas in my life.
Right.
I can't say I've ever. I don't know if they stand out, Hare Krishnas, because of the saris that they wear, and the hair, and the way that they dress, and when they approach you to talk to you. But I can't say I've ever met somebody who said that they are in the Unification Church. So who knows? I mean, I'm sure there's some. And then some movements say that they've got 2 million members when they've actually only got 200,000. So it would be hard to know exactly how many people.
You'd have to look at their ledger.
yeah, and I mean, I'm sure even on there, they're either going to downplay the amount of donations that they're given from individual members, or they're going to overplay the amount of
members they have.
Yeah. So, how do you think the Unification Church has been affected by COVID? I know you said that years ago people were encouraged to stand 3 foot away from each other, so that's probably come in quite handy with the social distancing.
Sure, if people are still practicing that, when Engine came into the church and said you can touch the opposite sex, you should learn how to relate.
Ballroom dance.
Boys and girls should learn how to ballroom dance. Like, you should learn how to relate normally with if you're a girl with a boy with a girl. And so I honestly have no idea what the culture is like now. I know that arranged marriages still happen, and those arrangements look more like young people find someone, they tell their parents, the parents talk to the other person's parents, and like this very traditional Christian way of marriage. But otherwise, like, how COVID has affected, I mean, they can't have large church meetings. So maybe they do something virtually, I'm guessing.
I mean, fundraising has probably been affected in some way as well, especially from the things like selling flowers on the street and things like that.
Yeah, or going shop to shop.
What I found with talking to people who have come from movements that do have specifically doomsday prophecies, and I've been like, well, they can't go door to door and they can't recruit people, and they can't fundraise. And they're like, yeah, but they're scaring people with the message of the end of the world. So actually, recruitment's been really good for them.
Maybe COVID. I have thought about it. I was like, I wonder how the church is spinning COVID and all these wildfires in California, and whether they're saying it's tied to some larger providential happening that, like, God is raining down judgment upon the world and only the unificationists are going to survive. I wonder. I don't know that that's the message, but I'm guessing they're spinning it in some way like that.
Yeah. I mean, I'd be interested to know, but then I don't like to get too involved because you never know who might come talking to you. Yeah.
Fundraising is probably stopped because the way that fundraising works is that they'll send out vans full of young people. So there are like 8 people in a van, and that's not proper social distancing. And
I know if the college campuses are, over here, I know the schools have only just gone back, so that was 7 to 8 months of the schools being closed, and universities were the same as well, so there would be no point to go and proselytize on a university campus over here because there were no students there. And fundraising, I'm guessing, is the same. If you're going to go fundraising shop to shop or down the high street, there's nobody to sell to because nothing's open and everybody's being told to stay indoors. We're actually going through a second lockdown now, so
oh wow,
it just wouldn't benefit a group of 8 people to go out and sell to nobody because everybody's trying to stay safe, or so I should hope anyway. But I know a lot of people don't believe in masks or the virus. They think the government's trying to control them, but who really knows? Not me.
Who knows?
I don't know. But I just have one last question before I hand it over to you and ask if there's anything you wanted to add. You mentioned at the very start that Sun Myung Moon was a self-proclaimed messiah.
Yeah.
Do you think that he was A, mentally ill, B, making his visions up altogether, or C, they were real?
Absolutely not C.
Okay.
I think a combination of A and B, because someone who he is by definition a pathological narcissist.
Right.
So, someone who treats other people, like makes everyone else object to him and justifies it with some righteousness, some personal righteousness, some idea that what he's doing is right. And they typically have a false sense of omnipotence. So just being all powerful, and that's absolutely mental illness. And whether he actually had those visions or just said he had those visions is, we'll never know. And I think his mental illness overtakes that reasoning.
Okay.
Yeah.
And was there anything that you feel that we've missed or haven't touched upon, or anything that you wanted to add at all?
Did we talk about fundraising at all?
We talked a little bit about it, but not in detail. So if there was anything you wanted to add, I definitely want to hear about it.
Sure. So fundraising was a huge part of the early Unification Church and like the recent Unification Church. So, my parents would go out fundraising for years and sleep 5 hours a night and just fundraise like 16 hours a day, selling trinkets or sun catchers or cookies or peanut brittle or, metal etching pictures, what else have you, nonsense tchotchkes. And they would make, my mom was literally one of the top fundraisers in the church during her day.
Wow.
And one of her biggest prides is like this huge handful of pins for her fundraising achievements. And fundraising was not only to financially support the church, but I think I mentioned that it's also kind of a spiritual practice. And before you would go out fundraising, you would set some kind of intention for like what spiritual effort you're gonna make. And one of the biggest ones was like having no concepts about other people, which meant anyone you see who you might be afraid of or who screams like stranger danger, no concepts. Go and try to sell them a sun catcher. And this was extremely dangerous. In the first generation, it wasn't as much because they were older. They were usually in their early 20s.
Right, yeah.
But in my generation, they would send, like, especially at the church school, we would go out in pairs, and we were like 14 and 15-year-olds. I was 16, 17 at the time, going shop to shop, like talking to strangers, trying to sell them little like cellophane flowers. And the whole idea of no concepts and living for the sake of others just put so many people in danger.
Yeah.
I know of at least one person who was raped and murdered because she was out on a fundraising run by herself and, never came back, and they found her body later. And it's incredible that even after that, the church continued fundraising. My younger brothers were part of this program called the Special Task Force, STF, which was just a program putting a bunch of kids in vans to go fundraise for a year or 2 years, and just to make money for the church. And where did all that money go? Like, to palaces in Korea and to buying more properties, while like so many young people were and families were in poverty. In poverty, can't afford school, can't afford clothes,
funding their son's drug habit, and and their children are completing suicide, and other members' children are completing suicide. One person actually wrote into me about their experience in the Unification Church, which I released as an exclusive Patreon episode, and I read this person's testimony out, and he knew 4 people that had either attempted or completed suicide. That is just not. And one of Some Young Moon's own children did, and that's not. It's not. That's too many people. It's
too many people.
And the depression rates across the world are astronomical, and mental health is on the decline for everybody. But 4 people, that's just, and they were people that he personally knew. That's an atrocious number. And when I was reading through his testimony, I thought it was absolutely harrowing that after one of these, children had gone through this experience, had completed suicide, and they were no longer here, and the parents didn't attend the Sunday service, and they got a phone call.
Oh my God, really?
They got a phone call asking why they weren't there, and basically everybody was saying that you have a duty, and you need to be at the church, and you need to do these things, and you have responsibilities, and so these parents were basically told that they weren't allowed to grieve, and that they have no reason to grieve. And it was very uncomfortable to read. And the person's English wasn't their first language, so I actually think that they were writing to me from a country over in Asia, and I know that culturally things like pride are very different to countries in the Western world, so I can't imagine the lengths people must be pushed to actually contemplate and go through with something like suicide. It was just but that just goes to show you the types of strain that these movements put on somebody's psyche, and the psychological damaging effects that they have on members of these types of movements.
Absolutely. I know people who self-harm. I know someone very close to me who attempted suicide twice. I struggle with depression and severe anxiety. I know a lot of ex-BCs, Moonies I know deal with depression and anxiety, and that stems from being treated as an object your whole life. Your wants and needs don't matter. Church first, faith first, absolute love, absolute faith, absolute obedience is what you have to practice. And you're supposed to believe in unconditional love, but in reality, all the quote care that's given to you is just total conditional love, conditional attention. And if you step a foot out of line for a second, you are shamed and just feel entirely guilty. So yeah, I know a lot of people who've experienced similar things personally as well. When I was leaving the church, it was just a roller coaster of like really high anxiety and really low depression and anger and,
Mm-hmm.
what do I do with all of this? Fortunately, I was in school and I just like channeled all my energy into academics. And I do know other people who've done really well and have had a lot of support, but there's still this huge group of young people who are just burdened with this past and
Yeah.
don't have an outlet to be heard or understood.
And if you feel trapped enough and feel like you have absolutely no other option, I mean, it's devastating, really.
Yeah.
But on a different note, do you think your parents truly love each other?
That's a hard question because I grew up seeing them fight a lot, and my mom would yell a lot and she's ultra controlling, and my dad would just kind of cower, and that's what I thought that was normal.
Mm-hmm. Well, if that's the house you're growing up in, of course that's what you would think.
Yeah, and I remember asking my parents if they love each other, and they would say yes, but then I was like, that doesn't look like love. I've watched enough movies and read enough books to understand that there are other types of love, at least, and this doesn't fit any of them. So I honestly have no idea. Maybe they think they do because their concept of love is something.
I guess I was just curious to know. I'm sure it must have happened for at least some of the arranged marriages where people genuinely do fall in love with each other. I mean, so many hundreds of people have been married under the Unification Church that there has to have been some successful relationships. You would hope so, at least, if people are going to tolerate each other and commit to a life inside the church. You would at least hope that some people could find people that they genuinely, loved, adored, cherished, wanted to spend their lives with, wanted to spend their time with, could sit happily in a room next to each other and just not feel completely resentful.
I know of a few, but they're few and far between, and they're lucky to have found that.
Mm-hmm. How do you think when your brother, your older brother first, and then when you and your brothers followed the movement, do you think your parents were most upset about you living sinfully, as in not under mother and father, or were they worried about how they might look to other church members?
I felt at the time that it was how they would look to other church members. I could be wrong about that. But like when I ended my marriage and when I started to kind of exit, they made it about themselves.
Right.
They totally made it about like we weren't good enough parents, and my mom said, my terrible past it was my fault that like you are this way. It had nothing to do with me, and it totally had to do with them and how they feel about themselves. And I remember a big thing in our family was like taking pictures together as a family, and we hated it because my parents wanted this image of this like happy, shiny family, and on the inside, all my brothers and I knew like this is not right. And this is not how we feel. So it felt like it was about them, and I brought that up with them, and it doesn't land. Doesn't land at all.
But I mean, you love your brothers, so
yes,
that is one example of something tangible and something positive and real that has come out of the situation. So it is possible that there are other silver linings across the Unification Church, like the universe of it. Because I always try and find something positive to hold on to during these interviews. And I think one of the things I found through speaking to yourself is your positive outlook on how you've had this anger and you've had all of these feelings, and you've recognized those things, and you've said to yourself that you can, that you can move forward if you take the right steps. So instead of being stuck and staying stuck where you were, you've made those positive changes and those steps to go forward, to have that healing journey and to make your own life, and to, I guess, get to know yourself again and familiarize yourself, or find yourself for the first time and familiarize yourself with who you are, and the things you genuinely enjoy, like salsa dancing.
Yes.
And you've been able to have these 8 years and all of the years to come of finding more of those things and having more of this journey. And I think that's something really exciting. Yeah.
And it's always equal parts exciting and terrifying, and hopeless and hopeful for me. And I'm always just stuck in the middle of all those things, because I've had this sordid past, but I want to understand it and do something with it. And there are things I enjoy, and I want to do them because I enjoy them, not because there's some purpose beyond that. And, I'm not going to save the world with my interest in salsa or yoga or drawing.
But you can focus your world on that instead of everybody else's.
Exactly.
And that's what's most important.
Yeah. Like learning that I am an individual. I matter. I have interests, and I'm going to pursue them. And it's hard to do that because it feels wrong sometimes, but I know it's right. So I just have to kind of fake it till I make it. Yeah. I mean, you've got to spend the rest of this time doing things that make you happy for the benefit of yourself and not for anybody else. So, and that's what you're doing, which is great. Yeah. And I know that, I know a lot of people struggle with that, doing things who've grown up in the church, like to find things they enjoy just because they enjoy it. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Well, that's all the questions that I've got, Jane. I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to add. We covered a lot. We've been speaking for 2.5 hours, so we've definitely bitten off a good chunk. I know we could probably speak for hours and hours, but I think we've definitely covered some good ground. Yeah, we have. Immediately, nothing else comes to mind. I think that's all I've got. Well, I do want to put a disclaimer, and I should have said this at the beginning of our chat, which is, I think my experience has been extreme relative to other second-gen members, because I did have a blessing. Not everyone has had a blessing. I did get close to the family. Not everyone was close to the family. I was in the church school. There are hundreds of kids who've gone through that church school, but not everyone went through it. And so my experience might be a little skewed relative to others, but I still hope that they find value. I think so. If they find this, they found value out of what I've shared. I think people will. I mean, carry on jotting down your thoughts, and maybe we can catch up in a few months' time and see if there's anything else we can get into. Yeah, I'll do that. For now, I'm going to say good evening, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day, Jane. Thank you so much for your time and for just speaking so candidly and in depth for our listeners today. I really, really appreciate it. And it's been such an honor to have such a lovely conversation with you today. Thank you. Likewise, and thank you for having this platform for other people to share their stories. It's absolutely been great. Thank you, Casey. My pleasure. I will speak to you soon, Jane. Take care. Thank you. Bye.
That is the end of this week's episode. If you'd like to get in touch, you can do so by emailing me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, and this has been the Cult Vault.